Preview.
Washington. George Washington owned a distillery. Donald Trump owns a winery. The comparisons between the first and the 45th presidents begin to fall apart there. Asked if he'd visit Charlottesville, VA, where white supremacists marched and a man plowed his car into a crowd of counter-protesters, President Trump on Tuesday talked about his business. "I own a house in Charlottesville," the president said at the end of a surreal press conference at Trump Tower. "Great place. I own actually one of the largest wineries in the United States in Charlottesville." Earlier in that press conference, the president had invoked Washington and defended those who, he said, went to Charlottesville to protest the removal of a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. George Washington was a slave owner, Trump said. "Are we going to take down statues of George Washington? You're changing history. You're changing culture. You had many people in that group other than neo-Nazis and white nationalists. And the press has treated them absolutely unfairly." Washington did own slaves, at Mount Vernon, and at the distillery he established the year after he left office. Like Trump, Washington believed that business and commerce were essential to self-governance. Washington's slave ownership was a sin that building or tearing down statues will not change. But the full measure of his place in history far transcends that. History comprises the best and worst instincts of humans, and all that is in between. Washington's presidency presaged an inevitable civil war that, despite the constantly competing narratives of its cause and meaning, struck a mighty blow against the moral obscenity of slavery. Despite his flaws, in moments of crisis, Washington inevitably turned to his service of the Commonwealth. In the aftermath of Charlottesville, Trump invoked his own wealth. It is difficult, in any stretch of history, to imagine the reluctant President Washington bragging about Mount Vernon in the winter of Valley Forge, or in any of the fledgling republic's crises. Next month marks the 221st anniversary of Washington's farewell address, where over 32 handwritten pages, the ultimate anti-tweet, Washington warned that the innate divisiveness of political parties would inflame conflict and resentment, and equate leadership with absolute power, the alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism, Washington wrote. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual, and sooner or later the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation, on the ruins of public liberty. The tendency to divide and form into political parties, Washington warned, serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasionally riot and insurrection. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption, which finds a facilitated access to the government itself through the channels of party passions. That is a spot-on description of Russian attempts to influence American elections, of neo-Nazis and counter-protesters marching in the streets, of statues being pulled down and speakers shouted down on college campuses. Trump, in his New York press conference, showed again that he is most comfortable in the bully pulpit attacking his enemies, and equally uncomfortable as healer-in-chief. Trump correctly pointed out that the racial tensions that translated into death at Charlottesville did not begin with his presidency. But the binary choice argument that Trump made, that there were violent people in the crowds of counter-protesters just as there were among the white supremacists who brought the first matches to the powder keg in Charlottesville, sent the nation further down the separate roads that Washington warned of. Trump's attempts at moral equivalency between the few who violently oppose equality versus the few whose rage over contemporary inequality causes them to meet violence with violence divided the country at a time when Trump could have unequivocally denounced racism and bigotry as the scourges they always have been. He could have removed the bully from the pulpit and declared that independence depends on interdependence. Instead, Trump stamped Charlottesville with defiance and more polarization. Ironically, the businessman president got his first post-Charlottesville blowback from the captains of industry who quit his manufacturing council. Trump dismissed them as grandstanders.